October 23, 1944.
Palawan Passage, Philippines.
Commander Soichi Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Adago and watched the Philippine Sea stretch to the horizon in every direction. Around him, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since Midway steamed in perfect formation through the pre-dawn darkness. 5 battleships, including the Yamato and the Musashi, the 2 largest warships ever built by any nation in human history. 12 cruisers. 15 destroyers. A force so powerful that its commander, Vice Admiral Kurita, had been told by Imperial General Headquarters that it represented Japan's final opportunity to change the course of the war. Kurita understood what final opportunity meant. It meant that if this operation failed, there was nothing left. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone. The experienced aviators who had made Japanese naval aviation the terror of the Pacific were dead over Midway and Rabaul and in the Marianas. The fuel that had once seemed inexhaustible was now measured and rationed with the precision of a nation that understood it was running out of everything that modern war required. What Japan still had, on the morning of October 23, 1944, was ships. Big ships. Ships with guns large enough to destroy anything the American Navy had put in the water. Ships that had been built with the understanding that when the time came for the decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine had always anticipated, they would be there to fight it. The time had come. The Americans had landed at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines on October 20th, and Imperial General Headquarters had activated Shogo, Operation Victory, the plan that would commit everything Japan had left to destroying the American invasion force before it could establish itself on Philippine soil. If the Philippines fell, Japan's supply lines from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies would be cut. Without that oil, the Japanese war machine would stop. Not slow down. Stop. Kurita knew this. Every admiral in the Japanese Navy knew this. And so they had assembled their last fleet and pointed it toward Leyte Gulf, where 700 American ships were anchored in the largest concentration of naval power in the history of the Pacific War. What followed over the next 4 days would be the largest naval battle in human history, a series of engagements spread across hundreds of miles of Philippine waters that would involve 367 ships, nearly 1,500 aircraft, and over 200,000 sailors and airmen from both sides. It would produce individual acts of courage so extraordinary that they strain the limits of what military history normally records. It would end with the destruction of the Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force and the permanent end of Japan's ability to contest American control of the Pacific. But before the end came the crisis, and the crisis came from an unexpected direction, from a place that no Japanese planner and no American commander had anticipated, from a group of small American ships that had no business fighting what they were about to fight and did it anyway because there was nobody else. To understand the Battle of Leyte Gulf, you have to understand what Japan was attempting with Shogo and why the plan was both strategically brilliant and tactically suicidal simultaneously. The Japanese plan divided its remaining naval forces into 4 separate groups attacking from different directions, designed to converge on Leyte Gulf from the north, south, and west simultaneously. The northern force, built around Japan's remaining carriers, would approach from the north and act as a decoy, drawing the powerful American Third Fleet under Admiral William Halsey away from Leyte Gulf. With Halsey gone, the center force under Kurita would transit the Sibuyan Sea, pass through San Bernardino Strait, and fall on the American landing force from the north. Simultaneously, the southern force would approach through Surigao Strait from the south, catching the Americans in a pincer. The carriers of the northern force carried almost no aircraft. The pilots who should have flown from them were dead. The carriers were there to be seen and chased, to draw Halsey's battleships and carriers north while Kurita's guns destroyed the invasion fleet at Leyte. It was a plan that sacrificed Japan's remaining carrier force as bait, accepting its destruction in exchange for the opportunity to destroy the American landing force. It was also a plan that required perfect coordination among forces that were hundreds of miles apart, operating under radio silence, without reliable intelligence on American positions and intentions, against an opponent who controlled the air and had submarines everywhere. The submarines struck first. On the morning of October 23rd, 2 American submarines, the Data and the Dace, found Kurita's center force in the Palawan Passage and attacked with devastating effect. The Data put 4 torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Adago, Kurita's flagship, sinking her in 18 minutes. Kurita himself was thrown into the water and had to be rescued by a destroyer. The Dace sank the cruiser Maya. The Data also heavily damaged the cruiser Takaro, forcing her to retire. In the first hour of the battle, before a single surface ship had fired a gun or a single aircraft had dropped a bomb, Japan had lost 2 heavy cruisers and had its fleet commander swimming in the Philippine Sea. Kurita transferred his flag to the Yamato and pressed on. He had come too far and the stakes were too high to turn back because of submarines. The air attacks came the following day, October 24th, as Kurita's force transited the Philippine Sea. American carrier aircraft from the Third Fleet found the center force and attacked in waves throughout the day, targeting the largest ships with bombs and torpedoes in the kind of sustained air assault that Japan had used against American ships in 1942 but had not faced itself until now. The Musashi, one of the two largest battleships ever built, absorbed the concentrated attention of the American aircraft. The mathematics of what the Musashi endured before sinking were staggering even by the standards of the Pacific War. 19 torpedo hits, 17 bomb hits, near misses that caused additional flooding. The ship that had been designed to be unsinkable took 4 hours to die under attacks that would have destroyed any other vessel in minutes, and in those 4 hours her crew fought flooding and fire with the discipline of men who understood that the ship had to keep fighting as long as possible. The Musashi finally rolled over and sank at 7:35 p.m. on October 24th, taking approximately half her crew with her. No other ship in the Pacific War absorbed as much punishment before sinking. But the loss of the Musashi, enormous as it was, did not stop Kurita. He continued through the Philippine Sea with his remaining ships, and at this point the plan that Japan had designed began to encounter the element that no plan survives, the decisions and mistakes of the opponent. Admiral Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, received reports of the Japanese northern force with its carriers approaching from the north. Halsey did exactly what the Japanese plan required him to do. He took his battleships and his carriers and went north to destroy the Japanese carriers, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Halsey's decision has been debated by naval historians ever since. He believed, not unreasonably given the intelligence available to him, that the northern force was the main Japanese threat and that destroying Japan's remaining carriers was the decisive objective. What he did not fully appreciate was that the northern force carriers had almost no aircraft, that they were bait, and that in chasing them north he was removing the only force capable of stopping Kurita from emerging from San Bernardino Strait and falling on the vulnerable American ships at Leyte Gulf. At 3 a.m. on October 25th, Kurita sent a force passed through San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea. The strait was unguarded. No American ships were waiting. No mines had been laid. The powerful force that had been attacked repeatedly for 2 days, that had lost the Musashi and 2 cruisers, that should have been neutralized, emerged into open water between its target and the American carriers that were supposed to be protecting it. What stood between Kurita's battleships and the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf was Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was Task Unit the 3rd of April, 77, a group of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts assigned to provide air support for the Leyte invasion. It was not a combat force in any meaningful sense against the ships it was about to face. Its 6 escort carriers were slow and thin-skinned, designed to support ground operations, not to fight surface battles. Its 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts were small ships armed with torpedoes and guns that were designed for anti-submarine warfare, not for engaging battleships whose main guns fired shells weighing as much as a small automobile. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded Taffy 3 from his flagship, the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay. At 6:47 a.m. on October 25th, lookouts reported large-caliber naval gunfire splashes nearby, the distinctive colored dye marker shells that Japanese warships used to track their fire. Sprague initially thought it was American ships conducting exercises. Then the shells started falling closer and the lookouts reported Japanese pagoda masts on the horizon. Kurita's entire center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, was bearing down on Taffy 3 at full speed. What Sprague did in the next few minutes was make the only decisions available to him. He ordered his escort carriers to run toward a rain squall to the east for cover. He ordered his aircraft to attack. He called for help from anyone who could reach him. And then he watched his destroyers and destroyer escorts turn toward the Japanese fleet and attack. The charge of the destroyers at the Battle of Samar, which is the name given to the engagement between Taffy 3 and Kurita's center force, was one of the most extraordinary acts of collective courage in the history of naval warfare. 3 destroyers, the Hull, the Johnston, and the Hyman, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts turned toward a Japanese fleet that outgunned them so completely that the engagement should have lasted approximately 15 minutes before every American ship was on the bottom. The Johnston led the charge. Commander Ernest Evans, her captain, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma who had told his crew when he assumed command that he intended to fight the ship until she sank or until the enemy sank, ordered flank speed and steered directly toward the Japanese fleet. At 10,000 yards, Evans opened fire with the Johnston's 5-inch guns against cruisers whose 8-inch guns could hit him from twice the distance. At 9,000 yards, he fired a spread of 10 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Yamato, striking her and blowing her bow off. The Japanese fleet opened fire on the Johnston with everything they had. 14-inch shells from battleships, 8-inch shells from cruisers. The Johnston was hit repeatedly, losing power to her engines and her steering, her forward fireroom destroyed, her bridge wrecked. Evans, wounded in the face and hands, continued to direct the fight from the open bridge. The Johnston, crippled and on fire, continued fighting. Her remaining guns fired at whatever targets presented themselves. She attracted Japanese fire that might otherwise have been directed at the escort carriers she was protecting. She survived for 2.5 hours after absorbing damage that should have sunk her in minutes. When the Johnston finally sank, Evans was last seen standing in the water near a life raft. He was never found. Commander Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The Japanese destroyer commander whose ships finally finished the Johnston reportedly stood at attention and saluted as she went down. The hull was sunk after absorbing 40 hits from weapons ranging from 5-inch shells to 14-inch main battery rounds. She went down with half her crew. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts was hit so many times by cruiser fire that her crew lost count. She sank with the words spoken by her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, echoing across the water. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." They did what damage they could. The Johnston, the hull, and the Samuel B. Roberts bought time with their lives, time that allowed the escort carriers to run, time that allowed aircraft from Taffy 3 and from other Taffy units to attack the Japanese fleet with bombs, torpedoes, and in the final desperate minutes of the battle, with aircraft that had already dropped their weapons and were making dry runs over Japanese ships to distract their gunners. Kurita, watching the battle from the Yamato, was receiving a picture of the engagement that his incomplete and inaccurate intelligence was interpreting incorrectly. The ferocity of the American destroyer attacks, the intensity of the air attacks, the apparent size of the force opposing him, convinced him that he was facing heavy American carriers and their escorts rather than the small ships he was actually fighting. He had been told that Halsey's powerful Third Fleet was nearby. The aggressive American response looked like the leading edge of a much larger force. At 9:11 a.m., with the escort carriers running hard and his cruisers closing to point-blank range, Kurita ordered his fleet to break off the engagement and reform. Taffy 3 could not believe it. Ships that had been preparing to die watched the Japanese fleet turn away. Sprague, who had been trying to buy time for his carriers to reach safety and had expected every minute to be his last, received the news with the kind of disbelief that combat veterans describe when the outcome they had prepared for does not arrive. The Japanese fleet that had been minutes from destroying the American invasion force at Leyte Gulf withdrew without completing its mission. The force that had been sent on a mission described by its own commanders as a death ride had turned away from the moment that death ride was supposed to accomplish. Kurita spent several hours attempting to reorganize his force and decide what to do next. He eventually concluded that the mission was not achievable and turned his fleet towards San Bernardino Strait and home. He had lost 3 heavy cruisers in the battle off Samar. He had not sunk a single American carrier. While the drama of Samar was unfolding, the southern force attempting to come through Surigao Strait from the south was being destroyed in what would prove to be the last battleship versus battleship engagement in naval history. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had positioned his battleships and cruisers across the northern end of Surigao Strait in a classic crossing of the T, the maneuver that allows one fleet to bring all its guns to bear while the opposing fleet can only fire its forward guns. The Japanese southern force, already weakened by torpedo attacks from American destroyers and PT boats during its approach, steamed into this trap and was annihilated. Oldendorf's flagship was the West Virginia, one of the battleships that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor nearly 3 years earlier. The West Virginia, raised from the harbor mud, repaired, modernized, and returned to service, put her 14-inch guns on the Japanese fleet at Surigao Strait and fired until the targets disappeared. Pearl Harbor was being repaid in the waters of the Philippines by a ship that had been on the bottom of the harbor when Japan thought the Pacific Fleet was finished. The northern force, which had successfully drawn Halsey north, was found and attacked by his carriers throughout October 25th. The remaining Japanese carriers, stripped of aircraft and sent as sacrificial bait, were sunk one by one. The Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor strike force, went down in the afternoon. Her crew lined the flight deck and sang the Japanese national anthem as she sank. When the Battle of Leyte Gulf ended on October 26th, the scale of the Japanese defeat was almost incomprehensible. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and approximately 10,000 sailors. The American Navy had lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and approximately 3,000 sailors, most of them from Taffy 3. The Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The ships that survived Leyte Gulf lacked the fuel to sortie again in any strength. The pilots who might have flown from carriers were dead. The experienced officers who might have planned future operations were at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Japan would continue to fight, with kamikaze aircraft and with the suicidal bravery that characterized its forces to the end, but the organized naval power that had made it the dominant force in the Pacific from December 1941 through the spring of 1942 was gone. The men of Taffy 3 who had charged Japanese battleships in destroyers designed for anti-submarine work had done something that naval doctrine considered impossible. They had stopped a fleet with smaller ships through the force of their attack and the confusion that attack created. They had bought time with their lives and their ships, and the time they bought had been enough. Admiral Sprague, assessing the battle afterward, described what the men of his escort group had accomplished with the particular precision of an officer who understood exactly what the odds had been. The failure of the enemy to destroy all of the escort carriers can be attributed to our successful smokescreen, our dodging of salvos, the attacks of our escorts, the strikes of our aircraft, and the definite partiality of Almighty God. He was right about all of it, including the last part. The Battle of Leyte Gulf decided the Pacific War in the same way that Midway had decided it 2 years earlier, not by ending the fighting, which would continue for another year at enormous cost, but by removing any possibility that Japan could reverse the strategic situation. After Midway, Japan could not conduct offensive carrier operations. After Leyte Gulf, Japan could not conduct meaningful naval operations of any kind. The men who made that decision were not the admirals in their command posts, though Halsey and Oldendorf and Sprague made decisions that mattered enormously. The decision was made by Commander Ernest Evans steering the Johnston toward battleships at full speed and ordering his torpedo tubes manned. It was made by the crew of the hull absorbing 40 hits and keeping their guns firing. It was made by Lieutenant Commander Copeland telling his crew they were going to do what damage they could and meaning it. It was made, as American military decisions so often have been made, by men in small ships doing impossible things because there was nobody else and the thing needed to be done. The Japanese fleet that had come to destroy the American invasion of the Philippines was destroyed itself. The Pacific belonged to America. It had belonged to America since the Johnston turned toward the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Samar and opened fire. It was never going to belong to anyone else. The men in those small ships made sure of that.